Dalhousie for years. Roger's taught at Dalhousie for almost 20 years, 15, 20 years. He teaches technology there, he teaches studio, he teaches representation, he teaches a design build studio. Not only is he a teacher, he's an architect who's worked in Berlin and New York and lots of other places. He is a builder, he's a design builder. He's a researcher, he's putting on a couple books, including a book on a really fabulous carbon Cornel project, a little house. Beyond that, I would say that my dad would say that Roger's a good guy. Roger's very humble. He's very quiet about what he does. He does it very carefully and very thoughtfully. And it's great to have you here.
Good. Thank you, Neil. And thanks, everyone, for hanging on. We're kind of in the ninth inning here. And the good news is, one of the last things I said when I left last night to Lisa was that I would bring some joy to the screen. And it's joy for me because it involves kind of engaging in ideas and experiences of material presence and being out in the landscape. This is a kind of sliver of some of the things I do, but it's focused on a presentation of 3 design build projects that have been recently put into print by Stephanie White with On-Site Review, issue 41. So some of the presentation will focus on that text and those images. And further to that, I would like to introduce you to what I know to be an idea about an excursion. Everyone has their own kind of relief or release valves that might be in parallel to your creative practice. And speaking of Carmen, I'll pay a little homage to him because he and Ellen together have been of great significance in my development as an academic and a person. And they introduced me to this idea of travel and connecting the eye and the hand and the foot. And a big part of that process, of course, as you'll see, is drawing. So the other bit of good news is that not that long ago, I knocked like 50 slides off the front of the presentation. Right? Okay, everyone. Well, we're bookending this. It's fun, and I think it was okay that you did that. I might get some trouble in the parking lot after if I did that. So, yeah, there isn't any need really for me to go into and share everything that I've built, but rather focus on a few things. And I did have lecture notes. Where did they go? So part 1, I got rid of part 1. No, this was part 1, and I'm not going to, I don't want to make you sick. Let's go ahead here. I'm going to go ahead. So there's a lot of interesting stuff here I'm looking at. Where are we? So I've had a great time since I've been here, and I thank Neil for hosting me. It's a beautiful city. There's no lack of depth of architectural talent here, as evidenced by the buildings and the instructors you have at the school and the practitioners you have in the city. So that's been a pleasure. The title of the talk is Performative Prototypes, and I would say that the 2-week period generally, by the time you land and by the time you leave, you have 8 or 9 days. Most of these projects are completed in that short of time period. Most of them are also, and this is part of the pedagogical approach, most of them are not predetermined. So there's a kind of equation. We saw some of us saw the film a couple of days ago of constants and variables. But right away, I'm going to take us to this part. The three projects are actually all in some sort of proportion between land and water. There's a kind of dialogue happening. So I'm from the far east of Turtle Island, Canada, and here we have the phenomena of the Bay of Fundy. I've kind of zoomed in here, but the Bay of Fundy is the sort of this tidal force. It's moving in from the southwest to the northeast, and we have two projects here, the red and the blue, and then in the lower right corner is the city of Halifax. So I'll begin. Ordinary exploration begins with the juiciest sort of indecision, in deliberate then routine fits of absence of mind. Exploring requires the cloak of invisibility bicyclists and walkers take for granted. That's a quote by John Stilgoe from a book, I believe it's called Outside Lies Beautiful. Cognizant or dreaming, or somewhere in between, we are at any time in dialogue with the things that make up our environment. Each day threads a path that connects a spectrum of events, but what events and what things? Is a highway a reasonable framework to hang your experiential hat on? To Rome, all roads led, but the closer the approach, the more these same roads postured to afford defensibility of an empire. Access and yet access denied. What underlies any plans for our surroundings, and what do they support? The three projects that follow exist along a path, each use existing within a broader experiential narrative that expands conventional understandings of architectural program. Part of a design-build praxis, each project engages with remoteness and a limited palette of materials, tools, and skills. Pragmatic, they also navigate a broader field that reveals the sometimes latent qualities of site or a situation. Like land and conceptual art projects from the 60s and 70s, the margin as site is conflated with the effort to access it. Imagination, location, and time take on significant roles. These projects are cast as prototypes or proto-infrastructure. They demonstrate both a considered function and an instrumental approach for future work and architectural thought. They are humble things, models that suspend disbelief. Project 1, an inverted king post bridge. In the book Roads Lack Dedication, Ronnie Horn states, "A path, drive it, walk it, take it to be somewhere. When you're on a path, you're in the place you're in. There's no distinction between the path and the place itself." The path's a minor clearing, a simple parting. But it's a complex thing because it takes the shape of each place intimately. A path in sand is more sand, sometimes rustled up. A path in earth is compressed earth. A path in stone is a slight leveling of the stones. Sometimes a path is nothing but an indication on a map, the reality having been blown or washed away. The path goes through places, usually the most beautiful way, so that when you're on this way, you can see beautiful things. Sometimes the path wanders about, and you wander about with it. So imagine the marvel of Roebling's span over the East River in New York, or a series of purple planks, a wet and supporting passage across a stream as an order of business. In 2018, on the Bay of Fundy, between the Minas Channel and the Minas Basin, in a workshop, we grappled with spanning principles and many imaginative ideas. The building that I'd built with a previous summer workshop group some years earlier became an ideal classroom. It was near where we were camping and a 15-minute drive to the trailhead that would lead to Ward Falls. Over 2 days, we built several large-scale models of pre-cambered stress-skinned decks, tensegrity trusses, and trestles for the 30-foot river span. We presented them to a board member of the Cumberland Trailhead Association. And a tip of the hat to one of ours, Caleb McGinn. He actually is maybe here. Good to see you. And to say that Caleb collaborated with me on these 3 projects. And that was a real treat. So if you want to come back to Halifax, you can come back anytime. So over the 2 days, within 10 days, we had to finalize and build our design. And then as we set out on our first hike, people realized how arduous it would be to bring materials in 3.5 kilometers. I think we knew about that, but we were suspending that reality because we were pushing our pencils and having great thoughts about conceptual, theoretical, structural design and elegance and performance. So by the time we made that first hike in, there was a pretty quick consensus that it wasn't such a bad idea to try to use some materials from the site. So in that spirit, our workshop concepts then seemed heavy. Our approach shifted to combine logs felled on site and a metal strut and cable assembly prefabricated at a shop 12 kilometers away in the town of Parisboro. So the previous bridge had failed during a spring melt, and it was swept off its footings by a rush of water and ice from the canyon above. This partnership between a forestry company, Harrison Forestry Company, then in fact grants public access to this site, and our group allowed both access to the site and an improved bridge design. So within short order, and with the help of a particular community member that I've been collaborating with, there are several, but in this region for over 10 years, I think we found some suitable trees and we felled them and then we had to spin them. One of the interesting decisions here was whether to put the 2 large ends, which would perform differently, together on one end, or put the 2 small ends, or alternate. We ended up going for a certain kind of symmetry, i.e. the 2 tree butts at one end and the smaller tips at the other end, and then we shifted the steel compression strut to 1/3 of the length, I guess, which you can see here. So the steel strut that we've installed here the bridge in general is a kind of combination of high and low tech. The steel has a different kind of outlook with respect to durability, and with equal amounts of efforts and within a number of years, the wooden parts can be swapped out and the steel parts can remain. So that's a kind of strategic thought that I hope we can implement in the future. So as I was saying, 1/3 of the way, we installed this deep V-shaped compression strut and the cable assembly 2/3 along the length, closer to the smaller ends of the tapering tree trunks. Like a bowstring, the braided steel cables were directed back to the end supports, back here obviously, and tightened to push the sagging self-weight of the trees into an upward arching camber. So it's like a pre-cambered structure that was delightfully firm underfoot. If you've ever jumped on a horizontal beam that doesn't have much depth, like a tree, especially a wet green tree, there's a lot of bounce, but this actually was quite firm underfoot. So each end is different. The steel assembly that is the strut, the same craftsperson developed a handrail for us. I think you'll see a drawing of it here in a moment. We were working on that while Caleb was eating pie in the restaurant, I think. So here you can see it's a kind of superimposition of a section at either end with the smaller tips present along with the butt ends. This is the load test. Yeah, it's a gang. That's Laurie Curry, my oftentimes collaborator. Okay. Project 2. So this is, there's a text by David Berman from a book called Actual Air. Silver Jews, Purple Mountains, David Berman. And he says, if there was a book about this hallway, it would start. There is a road within the home, some pine slats in the corner, and lamps along the walls that give the path an endlessness at night. I remember the day I left the meter man standing in the hall. In my room, I drew his hard apple face as he waited in the cold shade. No matter how slight, it is a scene from history, a scene from a book. Are dreams set in hallways because the perspective is screwed, or because they are long, open, unused stages in our homes? The hallway was a dry riverbed, I dreamed one night, and an Indian turnpike on another. And it may have been those things before the house was there. I never heard the meter man leave, but I saw he was gone when I went out to hang his sketch on the wall. Sour furniture polish, winds rolled down the dark corridor, once a fir where each door now stands. If Christ had died in a hallway, we might pray in hallways, or wear little golden hallways around our necks. How can it still be unwarmed after so many passings? And outdoors that is somehow indoors. So this project's in the community of Spencer's Island, which is actually not an island. Already it sounds like Stranger Things, but there is an island offshore. And I started working here many years ago. If you know anything about the East Coast and many other places, every other town has a flagship wooden sailing vessel from the age of sail, late 19th century. And this place is no exception. And the ship associated with this town is called the Mary Celeste, which is an infamous ghost ship, and kind of coincided with Arthur Conan Doyle's writings, Sherlock Holmes, etc. So it's a bit of it's a bit poppy, and I would say that this project is kind of inspired, or we were joking, calling it a kind of Wes Anderson production. Very much a kind of one-liner that took us 10 days to kind of figure out and choreograph. And this photo kind of communicates that to me. So a preamble about this place. In the 1860s, there was a pier and a lighthouse. Not uncommon, but what was common that pier and that lighthouse would connect any small village to the rest of the world via the Bay of Fundy and the ocean. The pier then, surrounded by shipyard and now a ruin, sits in a public space amongst the remaining lighthouse, a restaurant, and a campground. In 2019, the outline of the original 350-foot-long structure was reenacted by a cast of 10. The shape and dimension of the pier emerging and re-emerging with the tide over a series of days. Over a 12-hour tidal cycle, the water flow in and out of the Bay of Fundy is 110 billion short tons. This is twice as much as the total flow of all the rivers in the world over the same period. And there's a couple of geographical and other logics, like the bathtub effect and the coexistence of the Gulf of Maine in relation to the tapering kind of funnel that causes these tremendously high tides. We claim the highest in the world, but I think Wales has very high tides. These approach 40 feet in places. So whilst camping on an adjacent repurposed road, our workday began to collaborate with the moon, nesting into the cycle of the tides, working with our primary structure, which was a channel of water, present and then absent every 6 hours. So that's the cast. This is the former road that used to go up the hill, but presently there's another road that runs around. So the Mary Celeste was in fact built in this same community. So the wharf seems to be a piece of infrastructure which is both workerly and social, like a number of such things, and that relates to some of my other research in the North Atlantic. And I'm working on a kind of comparison of settlement patterns, landscape, infrastructure, and I suppose urban form. And so this was an opportunity finally to do a project in what we've come to describe as water space. So I've long since been fascinated with the monumental scale and the character of the pier. You can see the ruins of it here, and this is a newer concrete slip. So already there's a kind of plurality about this that steps into other projects on this site that deal with a kind of shape-shifting from characters that would exist in the shipyard transposed to another site that has more to do with the connection to the world via the highway instead of via the ocean. But there's some diagrams of that building there, and it's in fact called the center, the uncertain center of the Mary Celeste. And that's soon to be published in, I understand, I haven't seen the publication, but it's in Innate Terrain. That's a book on landscape architecture that's coming out soon, forthcoming. So at low tide, a kind of non-site emerged. The kind is described by Robert Smithson as the site is where peace should be but isn't. Some 300 feet from the rack line, working not so much in littoral space but rather the ocean floor, a benthic zone of depths felt uncanny. So on that final day, very early in the morning, at low tide, which coincided with low tide, we began. And we set up a campfire at the kind of rack line, you know, where the seaweed gathers, where the tide is going to shift. We had a campfire there, put some tea on, and we had a one-day event where we invited community members to come in, of course, to tell stories and share some of their lifetime experiences with the other wharf. Pardon me. These are worth pausing at for a moment. This is kind of like a large sort of drawing, if you would. And the slides that follow will demonstrate just how simple the structural approach is. We sort of adopted some lobster traps that were filled with ballast and ropes, and that's basically what we used. And we tethered down the two corners out there and then pulled them back. This warrants explanation as well. That is a kind of instrument, a very direct one, that helped us determine the height of high tide. So before this, and the very first slide, that's the group in the boat, the rowboat, looking at a single buoy that had a rope on it that went to the bottom of the ocean, and every 5 feet there was a knot. So it took us a couple of days to get out there on a clear, when the water was especially clear, and pull that so that it was basically vertical, and then measured the 5-foot increments to understand just how tall this stick needed to be. So the water line's up here. And then most important was the dimension of these guy ropes. So there are 3 of those on each corner, and that's the dimension we needed. So after this all goes away, then we keep the ropes and their length, and we put a buoy at the top of that, which are those buoys on either side there. It's a kind of kit. I won't go too much into that concept that I adopted of the 5 obstructions, but this is the 3rd obstruction. The second one was in Ile-Madame, and I'm shopping around for collaborators for a 4th and a 5th, if you know of anyone. But I have these bits, and I will travel. So I'll bring some tools. And so this was the install day. We're out here in this kind of murky, horizonless other world. Lobster traps and ballast. Surrounded by a horizonless, fog-blanketed space, we implemented what we previously rehearsed the night before, the moon having worked all the while to pull the mass of the ocean out and away, and the sun slowly replacing the dark of night. There is a shoulder of the tidal change. There, at the shoulder of the tidal change, with the sea around us, we set up anchors and guy ropes that would later tighten as the sea slowly set the rising floats into the outline of the pier. So tide's starting to come back in here. We still can't see more than 50 or 60 feet away from us. This is a shot kind of at, not quite mid-tide. Again. So on that day, we staged our production in the 6 hours we had until high tide. It made me think of Walter de Maria's 1977 project Lightning Field, and knowing that it sings when the lightning strikes, and in a very humble way, similarly, this project really has a moment, a flash moment when the tide is highest and the figure is taut, and then it starts to deflate again. So at 6 a.m. on that day, as I was saying, we set a fire high up on the beach along the rim of seaweed from the last high tide. We had publicized the event, inviting community members from Spencer's Island and all along the shore to join us and tell us stories of the pier and share in a late morning campfire coffee. With the beach as our stage, we became actors, commingling with our audience while we worked. Around noon, the beach fire we set 6 hours earlier was extinguished, the tide was at its highest, and with the floats aligned, our project was complete. Okay. That's part one. And part two and part three are kind of combined. More good news. So I would be, it's an opportunity to really share, I guess, and to also reveal a bit about, what can be perceived as a sort of a very free approach, that is thinking through drawing. This is a kind of recipe that Carmen came up with, and I've had the pleasure to adopt, and I've probably given, I don't know, at least a dozen drawing workshops in Norway and in Newfoundland. I had a chance to do a workshop with Mary Pratt. That was a lot of fun. And she talked about the role of drawing in her painting practice, and that was fun. And together we kind of worked through a day of drawing with a bunch of architects, which was not easy. And some people refused to participate, and I'm not sure why, but it's, the mode of the drawing is intentionally large, so you're drawing publicly. So, those people that are in the piazzas and traveling around with performance equipment, we're kind of doing that with a gang of people. We're drawing with Conte because it offers the least amount of resistance to capturing three-dimensional form. It's really compressed, so it's quite hard. It's not as soft as what we might know to be charcoal. And it involves this kind of whirlwind tour as a way of suspending disbelief and staying focused on the problems and potential of reading and drawing new or familiar places. As important is the idea of a critical review, at which point you can observe accidents, breakthroughs, or this idea of architectural phenomena, which is like the kind of the zone where you get into a kind of expression through drawing that it doesn't need to look like what you're drawing, but you're communicating a kind of atmosphere, if you would. This is a typical drawing review with Carmen here. And this is actually an office of Norwegian architects. And I'll try to move more quickly. The advantage of that excursion is it's a good opportunity to take a vacation for a while. As I often have, you'll see some drawings further along where we've traveled to see the Ionian cities and Morocco, Iceland. So the first step is to really draw one another in plan and section. The second step is to start to consider, and I find the first step the hardest, modeling geometric form, then including habitable space. We're kind of getting into a more sophisticated representation, and then this is the fourth and final kind of step. These are sort of one-day workshops of discussions and approaches that are nested and iterative. And here you can see a plan view. These are my drawings, but you can see a plan view, of this really beautiful stone structure. And that's kind of what it looks like. The Conte sometimes goes into a use of ink and water. And I was looking at this and thinking about the drone footage, a lot of which we see these days. And I haven't gotten one of those yet. But I love this drawing because it's quite simple, and it didn't take very long to do, but it did take me a long time to walk around this stadium. And you can see that trail there and this trail here. And you can see a bit of a framework of some regulating lines. So I actually kind of have an idea of how many people the stadium holds because I was kind of guesstimating, thinking about it, and then kind of put that drawing in motion. Another excursion, and I'll share this work quickly, but it was quite an honor to receive an artist residency to travel to the very far north, 79 degrees latitude, in Sapmi, the land of the Sami or the Samisk. And so Norway goes up and up and up and over, and I was very close to that intersection between the westernmost tip of Russia and the northernmost tip of Finland and the easternmost tip of Norway. So very remote. I had the privilege to meet Algi Guapa. The residency was named after one of the few Sami artists to be kind of mainstream in the context of modern art. His name is Ivar Jaks. And but now deceased Algi was a companion, and it's a kind of nice coincidence. He and others would make these large projects out of ice. They were kind of like a mobile theatrical stage set that they would melt together at each location and then cut them again with chainsaws. And it reminded me a little bit of some of the great stuff that's happening here as part of the warming huts. Algi actually is kind of considered a mad poet, but he, for more serious than that, more problematic, he was within the country considered a terrorist because he and others, through their art practice, the Mazi group, were protesting against the Norwegian government flooding communities to make a hydroelectric dam. And so through their means, which weren't violent but rather activist, they were arrested and then kind of designated to be problems of the state, I guess. In his later years, as other Norwegian or Scandinavian artists, he had a kind of a stipend. And so he was able to work and be paid by the government for his art at the end of the day. My pitch here was that I would like to go to this area and try to illustrate some of their sacred landscapes, of which there are many. Most of them are kind of ruins now, but they are places where remains of persons would be honored and offerings would be placed. And then they have also this kind of societal device known as a yoik, and it's basically a song, and you can use it to celebrate someone, or you can use it to reprimand someone. And so I thought maybe I could try to graphically illustrate these in a very naive way, thinking about some of the drawings of John Cage. But moving through this landscape, and I was speaking with Terry and a few others last night, and I'm traveling alone here, but I did begin to experience like a certain feeling of uncanniness and the sublime. These landscapes are very glassy, I would say. The last bit to this project which I'd like to share is just to say that, this is kind of the parts of some of the milieu that I was working within. Landscape features designated as sacrificial stones, a part of bringing food and resources from the sea. Animals, fish would be slaughtered here and distributed to the community. Reading landscapes and designating them significant is not uncommon, but it's really an honor and a curiosity to learn about how there are similarities across cultures and differences across cultures. These are a set of trolls, which I tried to draw a couple of times there. They had the misfortune of stealing something yet again. They're giant trolls, mythological creatures. And in the process of making off with what they had, the sun came up and they were frozen in place. And so that's a kind of, obviously, a kind of approach to behavior or what's acceptable socially. Next, we're going to the northernmost tip, a place called Nordkapp. It's 79 degrees latitude, and anyone that is graphically inclined, if you go up there, you try to make a drawing of this. It's very difficult to draw an elevation, which is like kind of what I've been doing, elevation and plan, unless you're out in the ocean. So I was a bit nervous, and it was cold, and it was very windy, and it was very sunny. So this is a drawing I'm quite happy with. It's ink exclusively, and it's drawn with the wind exclusively. So I have that big 18 by 24 inch board, and I'm strategically placing large amounts of ink. That the first move created this heavier grain, and then a kind of other grain that it's not so evident in this shot, but that there were the two grains of the cliffside, and this was my abstraction that I was happy to walk away with. That's the view from that northernmost tip. Concurrently, and I was there for 2 months, and I was hanging out with Algie, and he took me to some of these sacred spaces and parks and archaeological sites, and this was one of them. This is imagine the predominant occupation there is reindeer herding, and they kind of migrate north to south, and the Sami people would do the same. And the geometry, there were nice distinctions between topography and topology in the last days. These reindeer are inhabiting the topography, and as a reindeer herder, you can move them in a certain direction, bring them up onto a ridge, a landscape ridge, and then much to their chagrin, there are these traps, basically. They're depressions in the earth, and some of the reindeer end up in those places and they meet their demise. But it was very powerful to observe this geometry in the landscape. And I don't know if this is it led to, well, I was making a series of drawings out of wire, which is something that I've been doing for a while, and it led to this kind of abstract representation of that. I'm also thinking about certain literatures like Journey into the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne, and we'll go to Iceland briefly next, but there in Snæfell's Nest on the western peninsula, there is a place from that book where people would journey to the center of the earth. Some shots of that. So, and just to give you a sense of the scale, so the last, second part of the final bit here, we're at 45 minutes, I shouldn't be too much longer. Photo credit here to another one of yours, Winnipeg and London-based architect Tanis Paul, whose idea it was to get me to go to Iceland and do something with a group of students. I had been there only briefly, only once before that. So she and I have been traveling together with students. I didn't read this page at all. Is that okay? So we're going to start with this. So I'm extending this idea of the excursion into Iceland just to demonstrate that there's a gang of us. And it does take some time to get into that mode. There's a bit of polite uncertainty or reluctance about the usefulness of this. Why are we drawing big? Why are we being exclusive with media? Why are you insisting that there's no perspective? And we can imagine as people who work orthographically that there's a benefit in that because you can approximate and carry proportion. even at the scale of a city or a scale of a working harbor. So at the top we can see everyone eventually finding a groove. If you look closely, there's a person. Actually, I'm not sure what that person's doing, but most of them are drawing. And of course, then we have reviews, and we take those drawings back. There's a lot to say about the landscape and the geology of Iceland, and I'm not going to go into that too much. I'm sure many here are equally knowledgeable in that regard, but to point out this fantastic phenomena that is where two tectonic plates meet. It's a democratic space, one of the older democratic spaces still existing. It's called Thingvellir. And again, it's where two tectonic plates meet. This is a drawing that I completed there. It's a kind of canyon that, in thinking about Iceland, there's a kind of suspension of disbelief to put forward the idea that there is an infinite amount of found architecture there in the form of landscape. And so if you know the buildings, they're quite direct, pragmatic, simple, even unarticulated. So there's this idea that those bits are working with larger bits. This is also understood to be as beautiful as any boulevard in the world, Les Champs-Élysées or Unter den Linden. It's a kind of boulevard. And a place of great significance in that the 7 settlements from across the island would meet here annually. The Constitution, which had to be memorized, would be recited. And there was an interesting designation of landscape features that had to do with the program of the Parliament. There's a law rock. This is an illustration of the drowning pool, where certain disagreeable types might make their demise. And we don't need to see more and more pictures, but these are a few panoramic shots that students had put together that corresponded with their design projects. We, in advance of going to Iceland as part of a design studio, we would try to pick a site and propose a building in a box. We would show up with these small boxes that were mountain huts and other kinds of research programs. And then we get knocked about a bit by Steve from Studio Granda, right? Good critic. I'm going to try to move. So we're popping around here. The quote from Ronnie Horn, as she's an American artist, as I may have said, but she's done a lot of beautiful work in relation to Iceland, you may know, including this building, which is called the Library of Water. And it has a rubber floor. We're all wearing these brand spanking new slippers. And we had the pleasure of having a review there. But the beautiful, almost invisible concept here is that each of these glass cylinders is filled with water from different glaciers around the island. And they, in fact, are quite different. And there's a sort of sediment that's quite different that gathers at the bottom. It almost looks like a 1 to 50,000 topographical map on the floor of these cylinders. Quite beautiful. And of course, we take this work home and have an exhibition. It's also important, especially if you're traveling in the Western Fjords, to be aware of the terns. Has anyone been attacked by a tern in Iceland? They're pretty wild. I was very embarrassed. I basically got attacked in front of students, and I crawled on my hands and knees, squealing to try to get into cover of the car. I think one remedy is you can carry a stick. You just put it up a bit higher over your head. And they tend to focus on that. This is a beach, the Black Beach, near Drehólea. It's famously portrayed in the Game of Thrones, I think. This is a house on the western peninsula in a town called Stickyholmer, which is also where, in the late 19th century, William Morris landed from his kind of trips back when there wasn't a road. The ring road that circumnavigates the island is a kind of infrastructural piece from the 70s. Prior to that, it was partial. And prior to that, there weren't roads. So the quote by Ronnie Horn about the distinction between a path and a road, or that roads lack dedication because of the expediency, really resonates with me. But that house on the horizon I've photographed 2 or 3 times, and I see it differently each time I go back there. It might be of interest to learn, this is a building in Hofsås in the north of Iceland, where there's an emigration museum, and many Icelandic folk emigrated here. I guess it would have been in the 1870s or 75. There was a volcanic eruption and then associated difficulties, and people came here. So this is the final act here, and a final and third design build project that was tacked on to a 2-week excursion. So we had not 14 days, but maybe 6 or 7 or 8 days, I don't remember. But the project had been cooking in conversation for a couple of years. It's a partnership between the Reykjavik Forestry Association and the Reykjavik Sculptors Association. And there aren't, as you know, a lot of trees in Iceland. So we were very privileged to use some of those. So over those few years, eventually it happened, and it in part happened because we showed up, I guess, right? And I like also the Icelandic name for this, Vetangur, which translates to the intersection of form and place. We've called this a forest cave. So here, and I'll read, in Iceland, it does feel as though one might slip into Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth. New and strange phenomena reveal themselves around each promontory. In the years between 2015 and 2019, I traveled there with students of architecture for several weeks. We camped and completed large format plein air orthographic sketches. This, of course, initially was Tanis's idea. And she and I continued to go, along with a lot of other people, but she and I also continued to settle differences on what constitutes suitable accommodations. I'm a camper and she's not. So this is seemingly a concern since the second half of the 9th century. There, our studies observe the relationships between landscape as found architecture, natural phenomena, coastal patterns, outpost shelters, and infrastructure such as Iceland's ring road and the harnessing of hydro and geothermal energy. We pause to draw distinctions, building on the same landscapes that William Morris wrote about in his journals while visiting Iceland in the 1870s. In 2015, we were invited to work with the sculpture group and the Forestry Association to build what we refer to as a forest cave. In 2019, we built it. The shelter is 3 kilometers up a hillside in Mogilsa, which is just outside to the west of the capital city of Reykjavik. It is built with round wooden timbers from the site and rough sawn lumber transported on a nearby service road. In a land scarce of trees, we felt honored to selectively use a few to provide a simple pause along a path that blocks the wind and hosts the sun. This nearby cave on the eastern side of Reykjavik, for me, was an inspiration to think about a material translation or a material shift, basically, between the stone to the wood and the material of the forest. So we had some tools, not a lot, and with permission to build, we set out. on a fairly defined path, which became more finished. Yep. Very much. Yep. 2 minutes. Okay. Yes, I'm at an hour. Thank you. So, what would have happened otherwise? Huh? Good thing I lost the 50 slides. So here we are in this little room, deciding to build another room, surveying with some pretty simple instruments, doing a survey of the materials, the wood we have. Some trees were cut down and used. There are stumps here, and I believe there's another one here that are used as a foundation. The third footing over there is a stone. That's the gang. It was my introduction to structural screws. So we really improvised, and I think probably even Caleb could speak to this a bit more clearly, in that he describes it as a high entropy state with a large degree of improvisation in response to disorder. I thought it was much more ordered than that, but it's an interesting space to work in, and this project is thought to be a first step in several stages where other groups or other artists will come to the site and add to this. Before we left, and often before we leave a build, we do some as-built drawings, which often look like normal drawings, but they're actually drawings of record of as-builts. And these are the final few slides. And that's it. Last slide. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Roger. Are there any questions?
All right. Clear as mud, huh?
Okay.
Well, I would like to ask one question, Roger. I'm very impressed with you say you go out for 2 weeks from scratch to build, you do it in 2 weeks, and mostly with students, although the first project there was also a local professional helping. Does it work all for them, or are there failed projects?
Well, the failed projects become multi-year projects, I think, sometimes. Yeah. But they do, and sometimes that's intentional, but it needs, whatever you do, it needs to be strong enough to exist on its own over another season and open enough to be receptive to whatever you add the next time. So it's really interesting in that way. The stuff ends up being quite, some of it is quite single-minded. Yeah. But it is fortunate. Yeah, I mean, there's not often a lot of professional help, but people are very keen to pick up skills quickly. Every student of architecture, myself included, wants to get to that material stage where you're making spaces. There's one more over here. Yeah.
It's actually a very similar question about the bridge you did in the first project. Beautiful structure. But it was whether it was a multi-year project where you built it 28 footings, because I couldn't quite work out the footings for the bridge. And then the next year you built the bridge, and then it got washed away and you did another one, or did you leave it in place? So anyone could walk across it, or?
Yeah, bits of that. That's like mostly accurate. The ruin of a bridge, we had nothing to do with. That was like someone invited me to see if we could fix the bridge, and we decided to build a new one. And the footings, there's no frost protection. The footings are simply wood timbers that in some cases are kind of spiked to the ground with reinforcement bar. And the bridge is public. It's open and it's public. And it was all completed within a 2-week period. Yeah. So that was arduous in the sense too. That was also 3+ kilometers. Like on the final day, some people elected not to come in, and I was like, that's great. You don't need to hike another 7 kilometers. So it's a bit of a. I just keep forgetting that that's not part of a healthy work day necessarily, but I get really excited about these sites and opportunities, which are few and far between. So there was a bit of support, community support, permission to build. These are factors that sometimes it takes forever to ascertain.
And did you check that? Did you check to see how well it survived? Did it survive the next winter?
It did, yeah. I think it's a couple of years old now. There's a kind of maintenance aspect that, you know, the cable should be tightened every once in a while, and it has survived, yeah. Yeah, that's probably like 4 years, I guess. Yeah. Yes.
I'm not sure if it's like Jeopardy, you know, has to put in the form of a question. The pieces strike me as sketches, like gesture pieces, and it's really wonderful. It took a while before you started showing the drawings. You know, but it's really nice to see the buildings and landscape in relation to the drawings that are obviously, you can't draw, as you said, you can't draw the whole thing, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you do it? And there's the description of the technique, working with the wind, drawing in collaboration with nature, poetic. I think there's something powerful about the relationship between drawing and making over a short term, and yet there's this very long geological time, or ecological durations and cycles that is in fact what you're responding to. It just reminded me, I know this is supposed to be a question, it reminded me, we were doing studio tempo, it's about time, and we started by reading Italo Calvino's Quickness, and in the end he gives a story, he ends up giving a short story of this ancient Chinese figure who does illustrations, and he says to the emperor, you have to pay me for 5 years to make a sketch of a tortoise. And it's a really short story, it only takes 3 sentences. I'm already stretching it too long. But in the end, he refuses and procrastinates. And finally, the king shows up and says, here it is, and he makes this perfect sketch in like half a second. Half of this work. But the idea is that it's from a lifetime.
Right.
Observing
Sure.
and all practice, I guess, is the way to do it in the art. And you clearly have a lot of practice in drawing, so you impart that to the students in situ. But there's something quite different about the building and the drawing, right? Maybe just responding to that.
Yes, I mean, you've dug into something I'm learning how to express, I guess, but it's, the drawings on site are not pictorial, they're more operational. And we're also drawing with materials too, so there's a kind of like slipperiness there that I'm comfortable with. And then you do the as-built and you kind of go back into a more normative mode of architectural representation. Yeah, I think that's operational drawings, yeah.
Any other questions? Thanks, Rod.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for the invite.